Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of December 7th, 2020. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again this week by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. How is our holiday interregnum going, Josh? Not a holiday, but...
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I was thinking, I feel like I've been struggling with that definition of where we are right now. And it's both, I think, the normal period of year, but also like during COVID. And then I think, not that you asked me a question. I know we want to get through things fast. I don't care. I'm just going to keep talking. No. But I think about that picture yesterday of the woman in Britain getting the first COVID vaccine. And at first I thought, oh, this is stupid. Why are they putting this around? And then today I'm walking the dogs and I'm thinking to myself, what would life look like after COVID? And now we're allowed to fantasize.
That's a good walking the dog question.
That is a good walking the dog question.
As you're avoiding neighbors on the sidewalk. Oh, it's probably too early.
Right. It is.
So given all that contemplation, we are going to contemplate some other things also today, though we will circle back to COVID if we can stay on schedule. I wanted to start today with some national election news that's coming out of Texas late last night in the wee hours. And that's the complaint that was filed by the state of Texas with the Supreme Court against the states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin. States we've heard a lot about.
A little bit.
States with close elections, all of which, completely coincidentally, Donald Trump lost in the presidential election. And this complaint from Texas is trying to get the election results nullified. And what the complaint basically says is that the states behaved illegally when, they changed the election laws outside of the legislative purview, in most cases as some kind of an emergency measure, and that they treated voters differently and, were treating some groups of voters more favorable than others, in this case, Democrats.
Democrat voters is how you say it.
Democrat voters, per the language of the complaint, quote unquote Democrat. The continuing tribute to Newt Gingrich's effect on political language.
Is that a thing? I've been wondering. All right, anyway, keep going. Just keep going.
It came from the Gingrich advice during the Gingrich insurgency mobilization. And then just a general claim that there were voting irregularities that were unconstitutionally relaxed, ballot integrity protections that those states were obligated to follow. So in other words, what do they want them to do? They basically want the election results thrown out, and they want the election and the choice of the electors thrown to each of the states' respective legislatures so that they would point presidential electors in a manner consistent with one of the weirdo provisions of the U.S. code that regulates elections. So, what does it all mean? It means what we've heard before. Texas is throwing in with what we've heard was a rumored Trump strategy to get Republican-led state legislators in these swing states that Trump lost, to throw out the electors that were chosen by the voters and to choose them and have the Republican majorities choose what would presumably be pro-Trump electors. Now, on one hand, we've kind of heard this was coming. It's just one more of the kind of bizarre strategies that have been emanating out of the White House and out of Trump allies and right-wing media for a while. But I think from our perspective, what do we make of the fact that essentially the state of Texas, meaning Attorney General Ken Paxton, and, certainly he seems complicit by his silence thus far, Governor Greg Abbott. What do we make of this? Now, there's a lot of things we could say. In the short term, it appears to be a last-ditch vehicle for plaintiffs that are losing that have been losing court battles in all of these states to try to challenge the election as we get very close to a point of no return for them. And it'll also stoke more media coverage for Trump. I've been still reading at the Woodward book, and there's some really great stuff in Bob Woodward's Rage about just how confident the Trump team feels and particularly how confident Trump feels in his ability to do things that just drives national media coverage. I think this will likely be one of those things. And if you're one of the Texans involved in this, particularly if you're Ken Paxton, there's really nothing wrong with that. I think the other thing, we have to sort of note, and we can go into some of the polling data on this. From a Texas perspective, this is something that the Texas base of the Republican leadership is going to be open to, or at least it's probably not going to ring very many negative bells. As we've, said many times and written many times before, this plays into rhetoric from Texas Republican officials that predate Donald Trump by a pretty long time. Texas Republican leaders have long stoked these attitudes of skepticism toward the election process among GOP rank and file, to the extent that these attitudes are now pretty prevalent among those voters, right? If the Republican leaders stoked these attitudes, Trump has inflamed them, and he continues to do so. And it's hard not to look at this and see that everybody is doing this at this point more or less in their self-interest, with not much chance of a substantive victory on the merits or the substance of the case, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we sort of talked about sort of the implications and fallout here, and this is certainly a short-term, implication, but also, it keeps this issue on the table for future use. I mean, I think the thing that sort of has been interesting from a very detached perspective in the sort of the assault on the democratic process that's been taking place is the fact that it was being done with zero evidence. And so it didn't matter how many court cases the Trump legal team has filed. It doesn't matter how many states or venues that they filed them in. They've overwhelmingly been turned away. And the reason that they've been overwhelmingly turned away is lack of evidence. I mean, to bring another Texan into the mix here, the lieutenant governor offered $1 million of his own money for someone to bring him evidence of fraud, which is curious.
Yes.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, but I would say, this is curious, again, given the fact that, and I think actually I'll add to this. The lieutenant governor said before the election that Democrats win in Texas would only be because they stole it. Again, for a state that is, has very strict laws, has continually, based on this idea of fraud, continue to make the laws stricter around voting, it's kind of remarkable that people can't, that the people can't marshal evidence from the past of significant voter fraud. And in a moment in which the president, the attorney general, right, a separate legal team, Republicans in every state are looking to find voter fraud under a national spotlight, and they can't. So on the one hand, you'd say, well, does this mean we're going to be done with this? And the answer clearly is no, we are not, because evidence is not a requirement.
Right. I think that's a good point. And, it's basically keeping the discourse going. And I think there's a real convergence of interests here, again, that I sort of lumped with the general term self-interest. But you were generous in calling Trump's legal team a legal team.
Well, they were accepted by a bar somewhere. I mean,
right. Well,
I
yes. They yes. Talk about a low bar.
I was gonna say, I guess team might not be anyway.
Yeah. So, but there's a lot of things. We said that this resonated with, and I just want to claim that without evidence.
Offensive to bars and teams everywhere.
Sorry, guys, guys and gals. But when we asked if people would trust the result of the presidential election, regardless of who wins, before the election, a big chunk of people wouldn't say yes. Right. That is, and we should say that was both Republicans and Democrats. But at this moment, the doubts that are being played upon are the doubts of Republicans. And 61% of Republicans in October said that they wouldn't trust the result of the presidential election. So, that tells me that when you're out there, kind of stoking this doubt and filing these lawsuits that, from a more, so we say, mainstream perspective, although I'm not sure that's exactly right, but you just call it what it is. From a Democratic perspective, this seems crazy. right, and destructive.
Well-
but I think it's not just a democratic perspective, as you say, given the preponderance of evidence. And
Well,
from a fact-based perspective, let's put it that way.
Well, and the point is that the inverse is crazy to Republicans. So ultimately, when we asked in that same October polling whether votes being counted inaccurately would be, a problem, 81% of Republicans said it would be an extremely serious or somewhat serious problem. So, and we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. And I mean, in some ways we're very, I reflect on it. It's almost funny, but it's sort of, I almost feel bad for politicians in the sense that, if you were a Republican elected official who felt like, all this, searching for voter fraud is, let's say it's bad for the process, it's bad. Let's say you have some real, misgivings about the Trump legal strategy and the overall, context of what we're talking about right now. It's pretty hard to go out and say, well, you know what? 81% of my voters think this thing, and I'm going to tell them they're wrong.
Right.
Good luck.
So I think that's what you get is, and so the best you really get is nervous silence.
Yeah, nervous silence or sort of, the types of acknowledgments of the electoral outcome that are so carefully crafted so as to allow someone to be unsure about what you've said.
Yeah.
Or for you to be able to say so.
Yeah, and I think the information kind of environment around this, or the kind of political information world that we live in now, makes it very hard to figure out how to get out of this. I mean, the strategy works. It drives liberals and Democrats crazy. But in some ways, that's exactly the point. And it drives reporters in the media crazy who, are looking, to make judgments of fact. And so, the media has to continually refute claims. And they're doing it in increasingly clear and dismissive terms. It's almost quaint to think back to the early days of the Trump campaign and then the early days of the Trump presidency. When there was this big debate over, whether you could say the president, quote unquote, lied.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah. No, I do.
And it seems, almost quaint now where, you can't really turn on at least, some of the cable news and even the major network news now without reporters and even anchors going, the president is claiming this and it is untrue, or the president said this and he is lying about it. That norm has been shattered, but the point being that the more that norm is shattered, the more it feeds the partisan view among Republicans, among at least a lot of Republicans, that the media is completely in the tank against Trump.
Yeah, and
by extension against them.
There's one other point I think we want to make about this, maybe before we move on, so we can get to another topic. But I don't also think you can't really discount the value of this legal case that we're talking about here. So Texas's attempt to overturn other states' results to the current Attorney General Ken Paxton, given his recent legal troubles and ethical lapses, at the very least, if not other problems, right? I mean, this, being sort of at the forefront of this.
That was very dainty of you.
I'm working on it. I'm practicing. Being at home a lot, you don't get as much practice at your daintiness. But right, a few weeks ago, the speculation in Texas was focusing on whether he was going to survive, this latest round of scandals, right? Relationships with an Austin real estate developer on the one hand, and then an acknowledge at least to multiple staffers affair with a former staffer in the Texas Senate who then went to work for the real estate developer, apparently, allegedly, completely separately. We'll just leave that alone. Talking about anything else is good for Ken Paxton, but I think it also speaks, just as a sort of an observation, I think it also speaks to why the Trump strategy is not working. Ultimately, the Trump strategy to overturn the results, and I sort of was, this is like an argument I'd have on my driveway with my dad kind of thing. But the Trump strategy to sort of, the idea that, especially that liberals were terrified of that, basically, regardless of the election results, all these state legislatures were going to come in and decide to invalidate the results and give the electors something else. And my, thing from the outset was, boy, that would require a lot of coordination and shared self-interest.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing right now, I think, on the range in which Republicans are allaying themselves is, sort of where they put themselves in the strategic self-interest of how they want to orient themselves to the post-Trump world. And for some people, that is a continued leaning into this for as long as possible. And again, based on their own circumstances on the one hand. For others, it looks a lot more like silence you know, and then you've got some very lawyerly statements in between. And so, you know, again, then there's the few people who would, you know, sort of are on the other side, but they're outliers who would say, yeah, Joe Biden won, let's move on. Right.
Yeah.
But I think that's sort of the other piece to this, you know, is that, I mean, when you look at these actions, you can't help but think about individual self-interest here.
Right. And not only is this something, you know, this is the Attorney General's name popping up in Google, you know, related to something other than his troubles, his multiple troubles. It's something that, you know, conservatives like and his base likes. And, you know, in a lot of ways, I mean, I think that, you know, as people discuss the Attorney General's prospects, shall we call them, I think one of his assets in this very difficult position is that he is, you know, well appreciated by, you know, the kind of far right activist wing of the Republican Party in Texas. These are the same people that were going to view this kind of action as, you know, as a positive thing, as not giving up, as sticking up for Donald Trump, as, you know, fighting against the, you know, what they see as the corruption of the system.
Yeah, and I think that's where Paxton has really well positioned himself, you know, and I'll put this in quotes. I'm not saying this per se, but like I'm thinking the word would be, but, you know, he's positioned himself as a warrior like Trump in some ways, right? In the sense that regardless of, you know, past statements, you know, reasonableness, whatever, if he believes in something, whether it's for, you know, especially like the faith-based community or the most committed Republican voters, you can expect the Attorney General to make a move, and he's continued to do that. And so I think that's, you know, to some degree, really insulated him from a lot of his other troubles in the same way that it's really insulated Trump, really, within the base.
I thought it was interesting and was never really very convinced. I mean, when this last round of stories broke, you know, there were some people that were, you know, very much saying, hey, look, he's going to resign. How does he survive something like this? You know, I mean, his wife is its senator. You know, there's just no way that, you know, he's going to be able to survive this. But the environment on, you know, surviving these kinds of scandals has changed. And I think it has to do with partisanship, right? And and more intense polarization, you know, and it would take some of his fellow Republicans to really to try to push him out. And even then, again, remember, this is an elected office. I don't know that you're gonna do that. We're branching off, but but
it relates to the next topic, though, right? I mean, ultimately, the context of the environment here matters, right? And so it's not. I mean, it is about outpartisanship. It's about the dislike of the other party. It's about really circling the wagons, that kind of thing. But we're also in an environment now where when somebody clearly does something wrong, right? And I feel comfortable saying that because ultimately state law actually dictates that a bunch of whistleblowers have been fired. And actually it's incumbent upon the Attorney General's office now to prove that they didn't do that. So right now, so I feel like that's a fair enough statement. But I mean, we're in an environment now where even when you've clearly done something wrong or can be perceived to be wrong by a large number of people, it's a question about whether you're going to take responsibility for that or whether you should even acknowledge wrongdoing.
Right.
And that's part of the political environment now. I mean, that's, I think, something that we're going to carry going forward, and we're seeing more of that. So, and the other piece of that is whether people will try to exact some degree of accountability, regardless of partisanship. Well, it's hard. I mean, we should stop. But I was like, it's hard to imagine how that happens in a Republican primary in Texas, given Ken Paxton's position amongst the most conservative voters in the state. He's not going to get challenged from the right. Someone's going to kind of have to come in as a moderate reformer and beat him in a Republican primary, and who that is going to be, and whether they're going to gain any,
who those voters
momentum.
are. The question is, who are those voters that are, where are you going to find the, 900,000 voters you're going to need to beat Ken Paxton in a primary?
Yeah.
In a Republican primary. Now, this all points, as we talk about Republican primaries, as we talk about the way that Republican officials in the state are reading the future and reading it, and very explicitly, I think, reading the post-2020 election, post-Trump in the White House future, wherever Trump winds up, it really does point to what we've been seeing on the handling of the biggest issue for our future right now, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, how we deal with, all of it, really. I mean, I was going to, I mean, the way it looks right now is really an issue of, we know that, there appears to be vaccines that work. There will be more. It's now a matter of getting the vaccines to people, which by all accounts, as a result of various decisions, there was also news on that this week, is going to take a while.
Right. It's a logistical challenge, to be fair.
Yeah.
In any case.
I mean, I heard in a couple of different venues that nobody really expected, to even begin on the civilian population till March. Yeah. There's a lot of, information floating around. I heard that both in Senate testimony yesterday and in Texas Senate testimony yesterday, and from, national medical figures. But closer to home, I mean, this really came home to roost has come home to roost this week, or really thrusts both the issue of the legislature kind of stirring in advance of the session, and the question of, how COVID is going to be treated in that context, when the Health and Human Services Committee in the Texas Senate held 2 days of hearings on COVID-19 this week. The first day was largely about handling the pandemic itself, looking at best practices, talking about therapeutics, and therapeutics in particular was on the agenda, and I think for reasons I'll postulate in a second. How to treat, quote unquote, treating COVID-19 patients at each state of the disease, and to talk about the vaccines and how they were going to be distributed. And actually those parts of the hearing where we heard from Dr. Hellerstedt, the head of state health services, and Cecile Young, the commissioner of HHS, were actually very factual and helpful and
clear-eyed.
Provided interesting information.
I mean, they were clear-eyed, they're very clear-eyed assessments in an otherwise political context.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then, and then there was a lot of discussion Monday about, collecting, modeling, and reporting data on tests, hospitalizations, et cetera, and examining who was doing what and all that, state agencies, local governments, private entities. And in the burr under the saddle there, honestly, was the quality of the data and the data reporting, particularly early on. And then today, and I had to turn it off for us to record this, focused on evaluating the effects of COVID on public health writ large. And there was a lot of attention today, and, various invited testimony on behavioral health, mental health, child abuse, family violence, long-term care residents, and the impact of delayed medical care. Now, as I said, there were elements of this, I think, where everybody played it reasonably straight. Mm-hmm. A lot of recapping and updating on, where we are at this moment, some discussion of where we had been. But you and I were both talking about this, and, it also suggested, not surprisingly, but again, we like to wait for evidence before we make suppositions, on this podcast anyway. It also suggested that the partisan politics that we've seen, frankly, cripple the national and the state responses while the ledge has been out of session are going to be alive and well in the ledge, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the Republican chair and the co-chair, Lois Kolkhorst and Senator Charles Perry, respectively, were pretty diplomatic in acknowledging the fact of the public health emergency. I don't think anybody could walk away and say they don't think it's happening or they're denialists or anything like this. But, if you watched this for any length of time, they were also pretty clear in their desire to pick around the edges of the sense of catastrophe here. Mm-hmm. They made efforts to highlight, the data reporting efforts, for example, in ways that I thought were likely to reinforce the doubts of people that were already inclined to be skeptical of the seriousness. And there's, a lot of talk about the trade-offs in health outcomes, for example, in limiting elective procedures. Now, I want to be quick to say there's nothing wrong or even, inaccurate about those two areas of questioning. Mm-hmm. The data reporting early on was pretty terrible.
Right.
The effort to collect and report this data is complicated. And there's a lot of things going on, but I think that, the tone of this resonated with the partisan patterns in public opinion we've seen.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, wholeheartedly. And in a way, again, we were talking about the constraints that legislators face, and ultimately, they face the constraints in some ways they create themselves. And this is, coming from the top down, but it's also coming again through the range of sorts of, either I would say infrequent communications from top, sort of especially Republican elected leaders, but also, in some cases, direct contradiction of good public health advice. I mean, I think the thing that you're kind of pointing out in terms of the focus of the hearings that's interesting is, one, the focus on sort of on therapeutics and the other costs of COVID not related to COVID related deaths, but again, other sorts of bad, medical outcomes, et cetera. It's certainly, a reasonable thing to explore, but it's all meant, I feel as though, given what we've seen thus far, what we see in the data, it's really all intended in some ways to downplay the seriousness of the pandemic relative to the cost of fighting it, which is kind of where we are at this point. I mean, I think, the discussion thus far has really been about how we can weather this storm to the point at which everybody gets vaccine, which basically means, as grim as we expect the winter to be, expect it to be grimmer still, because there's no expectation that people should take, well, I know there's a lot of expectation people should take personal responsibility. There's no enforcement mechanism behind it, right? So the question becomes, well, why is that the case? And ultimately it's just that the, sort of denial of COVID is really concentrated. I mean, just to put it bluntly. Yeah. So just to throw some numbers up here real quick. So, I mean, basically overall in our October 2020 University of Texas Tribune poll, about 47% of registered voters identified as Republicans. 27% of Texans say that they're living normally right now during the virus, coming and going as usual, and that's regardless of any sort of restrictions or directives otherwise. 73% of these groups, so 3 out of every 4 of these Texans, are Republicans. And 80% of those Republicans are white Republicans, because most Republicans are white. So when we're talking about the racial disparities in COVID, one of the other things that's sort of, devious in a lot of this is, the Republican Party in Texas is a majority white party. So about 74% of Republicans identify as white, as opposed to 55% of Democrats who identify as non-white. So when you're talking about Republican attitudes here, you're talking mostly about the attitudes of white Republican voters in Texas. So, what are some other examples of this? 74% of registered voters say that they're avoiding other people as much as possible, right? Well, who isn't? 6% of Democrats say they're not avoiding people. 23% of independents say they're not voting people. 27% of non-white Republicans say that they're not voting people. 42% of white female Republicans and 56% of white male Republicans say that they're not avoiding people. So about half. So when we talk about this, we're not talking about everybody who's skeptical of the virus or everybody who's behaving, let's say cheating the rules. We're really talking about a concentrated set of people. And, it kind of really multiplies the dangers of either the silence on the one hand by elected officials, or I would say even worse, the downplaying of the seriousness of the pandemic on the other hand, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, and, we have a blog post about this we put up on our website yesterday that people can find in the blog section at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. I think it's hard not to look at this and conclude that encouraging a kind of minimization of this that leads to, basically behavior, as you say, that is a threat to public health, that the responsibility for addressing that, given all the dynamics, and you're right, that we were just talking about with, partisanship and the interpretation of public information, in the context of elections, it operates here too. And that means that partisan leaders have to talk to their partisans.
Right. I mean,
because they're the only people that they're really going to I mean, look, there's the normal dynamics that we know about, that people really listen to, family and peers.
Yeah.
But given the sorting of, that we know has gone on, the dynamic is still at work there. You have to send consistent messages to your partisans to deflect some of this behavior. And we were just not, now look, a Senate committee hearing is not a huge public forum. I was surprised, there was very little news coverage, frankly, of that hearing yesterday, which I thought was very odd. And if you're a journalist and you're happening to hear this and you wrote about it, power to you and send me the story.
Send it to us. We'll tweet it back or something.
Yeah. But nonetheless, this is a leading indicator of what we're going to see in the session. It's a leading indicator of how, relatively well-placed senators, and just, not to put too, dull a point on it. I mean, Senator Colkhorst and Senator Perry are allies of the lieutenant governor. Mm-hmm. And they are not doing anything in this hearing, I don't think, that the lieutenant governor would not approve of. And that is an automatic kind of dynamic that goes with those political relationships. And at one of the low points, to my mind, of the hearing, in a discussion of mental health, Senator Perry, in a comment masquerading, frankly, as a question, expressed discontent, how there was just not enough attention to positive news about the pandemic, and that this kind of positive news would help mental health. Well, the problem with that is that there's not really any positive news right now.
Right.
And that if you're presenting positive news in the context of a significant group of people that are not taking it seriously to begin with, it's not the time for absent happy talk to make people feel a little better. And I should say the mental health professional he was talking to responded with, I thought in a way that was not combative, but was very effective in saying that, basically courage comes from facing hard things. It's not courageous if, you're not facing something that's difficult or hard. And I think we have to give people the chance to face things and be courageous in the face of that. And there are ways that we can do that, to paraphrase.
Yeah, so it's an absence of courage, you're saying.
Yes, it was a very interesting response.
Well, just to follow up on that, I think this is really important. There's been so much focus in the last week and a half, on Austin Mayor Steve Adler here in Texas and the fact that he encouraged people basically to stay at home while he himself was at a family sort of wedding party in Mexico that he had flown to on a private jet.
That's not bad enough.
Not a good look, right? Definitely not what you should be doing. But the point that we're trying to make
but you have to tell the whole story if we're going to really talk about how to be fair on a bipartisan basis. Not only did he go to Mexico on a private jet with a bunch of people, he then recorded a message urging people to not get together for the holidays that he recorded while in Mexico.
No, I imagine him.
We have to be fair here.
Getting a text on his phone, washing the sand off his feet, going into the hotel room to telling his kids, "Hey, give me a minute, I got to do something."
Right, and we should say, in all fairness, I think this morning or late yesterday, the mayor released a pretty. He kind of had to, but released a big mea culpa, saying, "Look, I've let you down. I'll have to re-earn your trust, etc." But
Well, number one, we should. Number one,
you have very little choice.
We shouldn't just say that that's BS, because ultimately a lot of people aren't doing that. So the fact of acknowledge fault, we should applaud. But the bigger picture here is that what Democrats are already following these guidelines.
Right.
All the public data we have indicates that by and large, significantly higher shares of Democrats are doing what they can,
right.
And now the significantly higher shares of independents are doing what they can to prevent the spread of the virus. Ultimately, Austin, Texas's Democratic mayor, Steve Adler, having a screw up is not going to change the behavior of Democratic voters. And honestly, good behavior by Steve Adler is not going to change the behavior of Republican voters. And that's why it's sort of besides the point. And we want to wrap up soon, but I do want to get to kind of the central nub of this. Really, this is the burr under my saddle, I think, for weeks now, which is this idea.
Tell us, cowboy.
I'm going to. It's this idea of COVID fatigue, this thing you're hearing about. Now, look, ultimately, COVID fatigue, sure, it's a real enough thing. We're all sick of being at home. We're all sick of, the things we can't do and the things we've missed out on in this last year. That is, undoubtedly
We've all
true.
probably done something that we thought, well, that was probably a risk I shouldn't have taken.
Yeah, almost certainly. But the thing about this sort of prevalence of this idea, COVID fatigue, is that, there's a couple problems with it. Number one, and I always think about these kind of things in the sense of, does this really describe people? Is this true? Because a lot of times when you hear these broad, statements about, people have COVID fatigue, so they don't want more restrictions. They won't listen to them. And it's like, who are you talking about? And I think the data we just went through kind of makes a clear point here. You're not talking about everybody. And I know we work at a higher ed institution, so I shouldn't say this, but I feel like, this was the same conversation that was going on. We're talking about the discussion about reopening universities. Yeah. Right. You're saying, we have to reopen universities. We have to reopen universities. Well, look, you're talking about, in the U.S. right now, about 30% of the population has a college degree. I'm sure there are a lot of other tangential benefits to the communities, to economies, to individuals that are related to opening colleges and universities. But ultimately, that was a large discussion talking about a minority of people in a distinct age group, an elite population within that age group. It's the same thing here. We're not talking about everybody. The data tell us we're talking about a concentrated set of Republicans, in particular white Republicans, and even more particular white male Republicans, who are not getting a consistent message from people that they would listen to, telling them that maybe they should cool it. Maybe they shouldn't have that tailgate. And the thing is that this idea of fatigue, what the problem is it becomes justification for other people. As you know, I did a lot of work in academic honesty work at some point, and one of the biggest predictors of whether people cheat on tests is thinking that other people are cheating. So when the news media reports that COVID fatigue is this prevalent thing that's affecting everybody, if you're sitting there, it's sort of it's a signal to you, well, maybe I can do something. If everybody else is doing stuff, maybe I can do stuff too, or maybe these rules aren't really that important. If I'm predisposed to believe the rules aren't important because I've been told they're not, and I've been told that the disease is overblown, well, then even more so likely that I should go out and do this stuff. And so the idea that, again, a small share, concentrated share of the population that has been misinformed about the virus is then, their behaviors are then being post hoc justified by media and others as just a natural feature of the experience we're all going through is just not true.
Right. And I think one of the, the after effects of that poor conceptualization and, basically it's just conceptually flawed and empirically flawed to think about what's going on and to think about the behavior in response to the pandemic is that when you don't address that directly, it metastasizes.
Yep.
And so in the absence of actually specifying the problem and addressing it directly, it's grown.
Well, and you know what? Let's wrap it back up. And this is a perfect place to probably finish, right? And then you get to a situation like where you are with voter fraud writ large and people's perception of it, right? We can have this huge election. We can have the Republican Attorney General tell us there's no significant voter fraud. We can have Republican appointed election security officials telling us this is the safest election in history. We can have state legislatures Republican state legislatures certifying the election results. We can have recounts that don't find changes in the votes. And yet we can still be sitting here with multiple, prominent elected officials saying that the fraud was rampant. We have multiple bills filed in the Texas legislature to make it harder to vote next time. We have the Attorney General of Texas trying to invalidate the election results in other states. And can you imagine if California and New York tried to invalidate Texas's election results? I don't want to imagine how many heads would be exploding. And it doesn't matter that there's no evidence, because ultimately what we see now is that it's metastasized to the point where you've got 80+% of Republican voters who believe that this fraud is a feature of the system. And if you're an elected official, and again, I said, I'm almost, if you didn't have a part in it, I'd almost feel bad for you. Now you're bound by this. And that's and the problem is that, in the case of COVID, it just means more death. And it means more strain on the healthcare system. And it's not really,
right.
As important as democracy is.
I think that the voting analogy is a good attitudinal one, but I think the one that the thing that you kind of get at there that we have to emphasize is that the key difference is that these misplaced attitudes are making the problem worse in terms of making voting harder. That's a passive negative outcome.
Right.
Right. In the case of the pandemic, because of the nature of epidemics and the way that the virus spreads, the longer you avoid recognizing this, or if you fail to avoid this, its costs are measured in sickness, death, economic hardship, in a way that makes it extremely frustrating to have people ignoring the available data, in my view. It's another podcast that ends on a happy note.
Well, I'd rather be fatigued than dead.
Yeah, I think that's what people are saying. The problem is, since we're saying that fatigue leads to death.
Right.
Thanks for listening. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our crew in the College of Liberal Arts Development Studio. Have a good week. We'll be back next week for one more podcast before the break. Take care and be well. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.